She had exactly 4 days to find a way out. 4 days before her name was permanently attached to the most feared duke in England, a man who wore silence like armor, whose presence made grown men suddenly remember appointments in other rooms, who had never once been seen laughing in public. Sophia Ashwood had a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was hers. The tea had gone cold. Sophia noticed it the way one notices small irrelevant things when the world has just shifted beneath their feet. Quietly, almost absurdly, with the detached clarity of someone whose mind refuses to process the larger catastrophe unfolding 3 feet away. Her father was still talking. She could hear the shape of his words without absorbing their meaning. Something about honor, something about arrangement, something about how it was, in fact, a tremendous opportunity for a young woman of her standing, which, as of 6 months ago, was considerably less stable than it had previously appeared. The cup sat in her hands, ivory porcelain, a small painted rose near the rim, a hairline crack along the base that no one had ever bothered to replace. She stared at that crack, ran her thumb along it, felt the sharp, familiar edge. "Sophia," her father's voice, this time with weight behind it. She looked up. Arthur Ashwood was not an unkind man. He was simply a man who had made the particular kind of desperate decision that desperate men make, quickly, quietly, without consulting the person most affected. He stood by the fireplace, with his hands clasped behind his back, and there was something in his posture, some slight rounding of the shoulders, that told her this conversation had cost him more than he was showing. That was the part that made it impossible to simply be angry. "The arrangement has been confirmed," he said. "The Duke of Blackmore has agreed to the terms. The ceremony will take place Friday. 4 days." She set the cup down very carefully on the side table. "I see," she said. Those 2 words carried nothing, no accusation, no panic, no fury, and that, she suspected, frightened her father more than screaming would have. "He is a man of considerable—" "I know who he is, father." Everyone knew who James Blackmore was. London had entire conversations about him, without ever using words like warm or approachable or pleasant at dinner. The Duke of Blackmore was 31 years old, possessed of a title so old it had its own mythology, and was regarded by polite society the way one regards a particularly handsome storm on the horizon, with uneasy admiration and a strong preference for being indoors. He had never been engaged before. The fact that he was now, to her, was not, Sophia suspected, motivated by any particular fondness for her specifically. She was a variable in an equation she hadn't been shown. A solution to a problem she hadn't been told existed. She rose from the chair, smoothed the front of her dress with steady hands, breathed once, slowly, through her nose. "When does he arrive?" Her father blinked. He had expected more resistance. She could see it in the brief confusion that crossed his face, the recalibration of a man prepared for an argument that wasn't coming. "This afternoon," he said. "For tea?" She nodded. "I'll need a new dress." He arrived at precisely 4 o'clock. Not approximately 4, not a few minutes after. Precisely. As though the man had synchronized himself to the house's clock on principle, and the principle mattered to him. Sophia heard the carriage before she saw it. She was standing near the window of the upstairs hall, not because she was watching for him, she was absolutely not watching for him, but because the light in that particular corridor was good for reading, and she had been trying very hard to read for the past 40 minutes without absorbing a single sentence. The carriage was dark. Of course it was. No crest on the door, which surprised her. Most men of his rank made certain everyone on the street knew exactly whose carriage was passing. But this one was plain, almost severe in its simplicity, drawn by 2 horses the color of charcoal. He stepped out without assistance. That was the first thing she noticed, not what he looked like. That registered a half-second later. With an inconvenient clarity she chose to file away and examine never. But the way he moved, there was no performance in it, no awareness of audience. He stepped onto the gravel drive and looked at the house the way a man looks at something he is genuinely trying to understand, not impress, and the very absence of performance was somehow more unsettling than any grand entrance could have been. Then he looked up, directly at the window, directly at her. Sophia did not step back. She was proud of that later. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make clear she had not been hiding, and then she turned and walked toward the staircase, with the calm deliberateness of someone who had somewhere more important to be. Her heart was doing something unreasonable in her chest. She told it to stop. The drawing room felt smaller with him in it. That was the only way she could describe it. The room had not changed. Same pale blue walls, same writing desk in the corner, same slightly overcrowded arrangement of chairs that her mother had installed before she died, and that no one had moved since. But James Blackmore had walked into it and somehow recalibrated the dimensions of everything around him without moving a single piece of furniture. He was taller than she'd expected. And his face, she permitted herself one honest assessment, was the kind of face that painters occasionally attempted and rarely got right. Not because it was flawlessly symmetrical or sculpted in the manner of a classical figure, but because it was specific, a jaw that carried tension even at rest, a mouth that seemed to know things, dark eyes, not stormy or dramatic, simply very dark, the kind that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and gave nothing back without deliberate effort. He was looking at her the same way she was looking at him. She felt that somewhere behind her sternum. She ignored it. "Miss Ashwood." His voice was lower than she'd imagined, unhurried. "Your Grace." She inclined her head, the precise degree that courtesy required, not an inch more. Her father gestured toward the chairs. They sat. Tea was poured. Conversation happened, her father and the Duke exchanging the kind of careful, surface-level pleasantries that wealthy men employ when they are both aware the actual business has already been settled, and this is merely the performance of civility. Sophia watched James Blackmore throughout. He held his cup with one hand loosely, without the slight stiffness that most men showed in formal settings. He answered her father's questions with economy. Complete sentences, no excess, nothing left dangling. Once, during a pause, his gaze shifted to the painting above the fireplace, a landscape, a river, unremarkable, and he looked at it with what seemed to be genuine attention, as though he'd found something in it worth considering. She found that strange. She found it interesting. She found it irritating that she found it interesting. Near the end of the visit, her father excused himself, with the subtlety of a man who believed he was being subtle, to retrieve some document from his study. The room went quiet. "You don't want this," Sophia said. It wasn't a question. It came out leveled and direct, the way she tended to speak when she was uncomfortable, which was not something she often admitted. James Blackmore looked at her. There was a pause. Not an awkward one. A considered one. "What makes you certain of that?" he said. "You haven't once tried to charm me." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, there and gone, like a candle behind glass. "Would you prefer that I had?" She opened her mouth, closed it. He set his cup down, rose and buttoned his coat with the same unhurried precision with which he'd done everything else. "Friday, Miss Ashwood," he said. It was not a demand. It was not a question. It existed in some register between the two that she didn't have a name for. He crossed to the door. "I haven't agreed," she said to his back. He paused at the threshold, did not turn around. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet." And then he was gone. She sat very still in the suddenly large room and stared at the place where he had been standing and tried to locate, somewhere in the reasonable architecture of her mind, a single logical foothold. She found none. She started making plans anyway. The plan was this: find a fiancé before Friday. Sophia spread this idea across her writing desk on Tuesday morning like a map she was trying to navigate by candlelight, full of gaps, several wrong turns, and an unsettling number of locations marked here be problems. But it was a plan. It had structure. It gave her hands something to do. The logic was straightforward enough. If she arrived Friday with a prior engagement, a legitimate one, witnessed and documented, then the Duke's arrangement would dissolve. Contracts of this nature depended on the woman's status as unattached. She was not a piece of property. She was a person, and persons in theory had prior commitments. She needed someone willing to play the part. She needed, in short, Viscount Harlow. Edmund Harlow was 28, handsome in the way that portraits are handsome, even features, warm colouring, an easy smile that he had learned early in life could open considerable doors. He had been in Sophia's orbit for 2 seasons, without ever quite committing to anything, drifting close and then away again in the unpredictable pattern of a man who enjoyed options. He would do this, she calculated. He would do this because Edmund Harlow had three things that perpetually required management: debts, pride, and a fundamental inability to say no to a beautiful woman with a specific request. She wrote him a letter, precise, careful, stripped of anything that could be misread. She described the situation, the terms, the necessity. She offered him the pearl earrings her grandmother had left her, not because they were worth a great deal, but because they were the most valuable thing she currently owned, and she needed him to understand that she was serious. The reply came within 2 hours. Miss Ashwood, I find myself entirely available to assist. The earrings are unnecessary, though I won't refuse them. Come to Harlow House at noon. E.H. She read the letter twice. Something about the easy speed of it made a small cold feeling settle in her stomach, the instinct of a person recognizing, just slightly too late, that a solution has arrived a little too smoothly. She set the instinct aside. She needed Edmund Harlow. She had 4 days. The instinct could wait. Harlow House was 3 streets from her father's townhouse, a fact of geography that had always struck Sophia as slightly too convenient for a man she was never entirely sure about. Edmund met her in the sitting room, standing as she entered with that smile already assembled, bright, practiced, genuinely charming despite its calculation. "You look worried," he said. "I look practical," she corrected. He laughed, gestured to the chair across from him. She sat without removing her gloves. "Tell me the full situation." She did. All of it. The arrangement, the Friday deadline, the Duke, the contract her father had signed. Edmund listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and by the time she finished he was no longer smiling in that easy way. He was watching her with an expression that was harder to read. "Blackmore," he said. "Yes. You understand who he is." "I am aware of his reputation, yes." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, turning his signet ring slowly around his finger, a gesture she had never seen him make before. "And if I agree," he said, "what exactly are you proposing? A formal engagement?" "A visible one, enough to nullify the other arrangement. And afterward?" "It dissolves quietly. You're inconvenienced for a week at most." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she noticed it, and found it slightly different from his usual manner of looking at her. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." She exhaled, released a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for 12 hours. "Thank you, Edmund." "Don't thank me yet." He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the street below. "Blackmore is going to find out." "He already knows," said a voice behind her. She spun. James Blackmore stood in the doorway of the sitting room. Her heart hit the back of her ribs so hard she nearly stood up. She did not stand up. She kept her hands flat on her knees and met his eyes and held them. He looked at her steadily. No anger, no performance of betrayal, no wounded pride. He simply looked at her the way he had the afternoon before, like someone genuinely interested in understanding the full picture. "How?" she started. "Harlow sent word." He said it without accusation, his gaze shifting briefly to Edmund. "We have an understanding." Edmund, to his credit, at least had the decency to look vaguely uncomfortable. Sophia felt the cold feeling from the letter return, larger now. "You told him," she said. You told him before I even arrived." Edmund said nothing. The signet ring turned. She stood, slowly, with the particular composure of a person who has been made a fool of and refuses to allow that to be visible on their face. James Blackmore stepped aside from the doorway. He did not block her path. He had never blocked her path. "Miss Ashwood," he said as she walked past him. She stopped, did not turn. "You have until Friday," he said quietly. "That hasn't changed." She walked out into the cold afternoon air. The door closed behind her, and somewhere in the hollow silence of the street, she realized that the man she was trying to escape had just shown her more courtesy than the man she'd trusted to help her. She didn't know what to do with that. She started walking home. The Ashworth Assembly was not the most prestigious event of the season. It was, however, the most attended, which in London's particular social economy amounted to the same thing, since prestige was ultimately a performance, and performances required an audience. By 8:30 on Tuesday evening, the Ashworth Ballroom contained approximately 140 people, and approximately 280 opinions about everything occurring within it. Sophia arrived with her father at 9:15, wearing a gown she had chosen with the specific intention of not appearing to have tried. Pale gold, deliberately simple, nothing that announced itself. She needed to be present without being an event. She needed to assess the room. She had a new plan. It was not yet fully formed, but its bones were there. She spotted him within 4 minutes. He was near the far wall, speaking to an older gentleman she recognized as a cabinet minister, Lord something. She could never remember titles when she was preoccupied, and James Blackmore was doing the thing she had noticed yesterday, which was listening with complete attention. Not the performance of listening that people offered at parties while their eyes navigated the room. Actual attention. The kind that made the person speaking to him straighten slightly, as though being genuinely seen was a physical sensation. But it was what happened next that she filed away, without meaning to. A young woman, no older than 17, clearly a first-season debutante from the careful terror in her posture, stumbled near the edge of the group and sent her champagne glass tilting toward James's coat. The room did not notice. Most people at a gathering of this size were too occupied with being seen to observe what was actually happening 3 feet away. James noticed. He stepped back, not dramatically, just precisely, just enough, and caught the girl's elbow with one hand to steady her, righted the glass with the other, and said something to her quietly that made her go from mortified to something approaching composed in the span of about 4 seconds. Then he returned to his conversation with the cabinet minister without any detectable change in his expression. No audience, no one to perform the gesture for. Sophia turned away from the window and looked at her champagne. She became aware, inconveniently, that she was reassessing something. She accepted a glass from a passing tray and began circulating with the purposeful casualness of someone who is absolutely not tracking the location of a specific person across a crowded room. Her first conversation was with Charlotte Vane, her closest friend since they were 12 years old, a woman whose greatest social skill was the ability to receive shocking information with perfect composure and only deploy her full reaction in private. "I heard," Charlotte said before Sophia could open her mouth. "Of course you did. Is it true? Blackmore?" "Apparently." Charlotte looked at her over the rim of her glass. Her expression was doing 3 things simultaneously: concern, fascination, and the barely suppressed excitement of someone adjacent to a significant event. "And you're here," Charlotte said. "I'm always here. You're here specifically. You're wearing gold, which you only wear when you're planning something. And you've checked the east wall twice since we started talking." Sophia said nothing. Charlotte lowered her voice. "I watched him arrive. He walked in, and the entire room recalibrated itself, and he didn't notice, or didn't care. I genuinely cannot tell which." "Neither can I," Sophia admitted, before she could stop herself. Charlotte looked at her sharply. It was a very small admission, barely a sentence, but Charlotte had known her for 14 years and had developed an almost forensic ability to identify when Sophia was being more honest than she intended. "Be careful," Charlotte said, not dramatically. Quietly, as a friend who has correctly identified that the danger here is not the kind involving visible edges. "I'm always careful. You're always precise. Those are different things." The dance was announced at 10. She had not planned for this part, or rather, she had accounted for it in the abstract, as one accounts for weather, likely manageable, possible to navigate with appropriate preparation. What she had not accounted for was the specific way the evening arranged itself, with the particular efficiency of fate performing a joke. She was standing near the edge of the floor when James Blackmore appeared at her left, not from across the room, not with the announcement of approaching footsteps, simply there, the way he seemed to be most places, without ceremony, without warning, as though space rearranged itself quietly around him rather than the other way around. "Miss Ashwood." "Your Grace," she turned to face him. "You seem to have a talent for proximity. You seem to have a talent for underestimating it." He extended his hand. "Will you dance?" It was, she noted, technically a question. Everything he said to her was technically a question. He never cornered, never commanded, just presented the option with a certainty that suggested he had already calculated which way she'd move. She placed her hand in his. The room noticed. She felt it, that collective shift in attention, the slight reorientation of faces, the sudden murmur of recalibrated conversations. London had seen the Duke of Blackmore at 100 gatherings. It had never seen him ask anyone to dance. She kept her eyes forward as they moved onto the floor. The music began. He danced the way he did everything else, with precision and without excess. No flourish, no performance. Just the correct movements made at the correct moments, and a steadiness beneath his hand at her back that she found against her will deeply uncomfortable to dismiss. "You're calculating something," he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her the same way he watched everything, steadily, without agenda. "I'm always calculating something," she said. "I know." A brief pause, measured to the music. "I find it interesting." "You find it interesting?" "Yes." He turned her through a figure. "Most people in a situation like yours would be performing. You're not. What would performing look like?" "Tears," he said, "or false warmth, or questions about my estate designed to sound like genuine curiosity." His eyes came back to hers. "You haven't asked me a single personal question." "I haven't decided yet," she said honestly, "whether the answers would make this better or worse." Something moved in his face. Not the ghost of a smile this time, something quieter than that, something she couldn't name. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in approximately 3 years." The music slowed toward its final phrase. She was aware, suddenly and with a precision she resented, of how close his hand was to her waist, of the warmth through the fabric, of the specific quality of attention he was giving her, not possessive, not performative, just present in a way that had no easy category. The last note fell. He released her properly, stepped back, inclined his head. "Thank you for the dance." She folded her hands in front of her, steadied herself without letting it show. "You haven't won anything," she said. The ghost of a smile returned, stayed slightly longer this time. "I know," he said, and walked away. She stood at the edge of the empty floor and tried to remember what her plan had been. Across the room, she caught Charlotte watching her. Charlotte said nothing. She simply looked at Sophia with the expression of a woman who has just observed something she will need to discuss at length at the earliest available opportunity, raised her glass a fraction of an inch, and turned back to her own conversation. Sophia did not go home for another hour. She stayed and circulated and spoke to people and said all the correct things in all the correct registers. She did everything she normally did at an event like this, except that some part of her mind remained, stubbornly, at the edge of the dance floor, standing in a moment that had already ended, turning it over, looking at it from every available angle. She found no satisfactory conclusion. She went home and lay in the dark and told herself she would think more clearly in the morning. She did not think more clearly in the morning. She didn't sleep well. This was a fact she refused to blame on anyone in particular, because blaming it on a specific person, on a specific pair of dark eyes and a specific quality of attention and a specific thing said at the end of a dance, would imply a connection she was not prepared to acknowledge. She blamed it on the wind. Wednesday came in grey and cold, the sky the colour of old pewter, the kind of morning that London produced when it wanted to communicate that beauty was, in fact, optional. Sophia was at her writing desk by 7, a cup of tea growing cold beside her, a letter she had started 3 times without finishing spread open in front of her. The letter was to her solicitor. The third draft was, objectively, no better than the first. She set down her pen. The plan, such as it remained, needed information. Specifically, it needed the kind of information that couldn't be found in drawing rooms or ballrooms, the kind that lived in documents and letters and the private geography of a person's life. She needed to understand James Blackmore. Not his reputation, which was a story the city had written about him and likely had the same relationship to truth as most city stories, partial, dramatized, assembled from fragments of fact and significant quantities of imagination. She needed the actual person. She told herself this was strategic. She told herself it multiple times on the walk to Blackmore House, which her father had pointed out to her once. A wide Palladian facade on a quiet street, the kind of building that communicated its own importance without needing to announce it. She had not been invited. She knocked anyway. The butler who opened the door was an older man with the expression of someone who had seen a considerable number of unexpected things in his career and had developed a policy of responding to all of them with the same measured equanimity. "His Grace is in the library," he said before she could explain herself. She blinked. You're not going to ask my name? I know who you are, Miss Ashwood. He stepped aside. He said you might come. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in. The library was on the second floor behind a door that stood slightly open. She could hear, before she reached it, the sound of papers, not frantic movement, just the steady, particular sound of a person working through documents with methodical attention. She pushed the door open. It was a proper library, not a decorative one. Not the kind of room designed to imply a man was well read while actually functioning as an extension of the drawing room. This was a room that worked. Shelves floor to ceiling, a rolling ladder on brass fittings, maps on one wall, a desk buried under an organized complexity of correspondence and ledgers, and what appeared to be architectural drawings. James Blackmore was standing behind the desk, reading something, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who is not surprised, but is nonetheless paying full attention. Miss Ashwood, you told your butler I might come. I considered it likely. He set down the paper in his hand. You want to know something about me? I want to know why, she said. The real reason, not the version my father received. He considered this. Then he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Not the formal visitor's chair, but the old leather one near the window, worn soft at the armrests, the kind of chair that had been chosen for comfort rather than appearance. She sat. He came around the desk and sat on the edge of it, not behind it, which she noticed, not on the authority side of the furniture. My brother died 4 years ago, he said. He said it without preamble, without the softening introduction that people usually employed around grief, the I'm afraid or you may have heard, just the fact, clean and direct. I didn't know you had a brother, she said. Most people don't. William was younger. He was... A pause, brief, controlled. He was better at most things than I was, and considerably better at most people than I was. He had a gift for it. Sophia sat very still. In the last year of his life, James continued, your father helped him. A financial difficulty, the kind that, had it become public, would have ended certain possibilities for William. Your father resolved it quietly, without expectation of return, and never spoke of it to anyone. He looked at her steadily. I know because William told me. The week before he died, the room was very quiet. Outside, a carriage passed on the street below, wheels on wet stone. And you felt you owed a debt, she said slowly. I felt I had been given an example, he said, of what a certain kind of man does when he can do something for someone. Your family's situation became known to me 6 months ago. I had the means to address it. I chose to. Through a marriage contract. Your father's terms, he said. Not mine. I would have... He stopped. Started again. I would have preferred a different conversation. Sophia looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough to feel slightly exposed by her own looking, and tried to locate the manipulation in it, the angle, the practiced delivery of a story designed to produce exactly this effect. She found none. That was, in some ways, the most unsettling thing she had encountered in several days. I should tell you, she said carefully, that understanding your reasons doesn't change my position. I know. I still don't intend to... I know, Miss Ashwood. He looked at her steadily, and for the first time there was something in those dark eyes that she recognized because she had felt it herself, the controlled, deliberate patience of a person managing something they didn't have a name for. I'm not asking you to change your mind. I'm just answering your question. She stood, moved toward the door. Near the threshold, she stopped. On a small table beside the door, a table she hadn't noticed coming in, ordinary enough, holding a few stacked books and a tray, was a single framed photograph. 2 young men. Boys, really. Somewhere between 15 and 17, standing in front of this same house, one slightly taller, one caught mid-laugh. The composition of the image accidental, and therefore completely real. She knew without asking which one had become the man in the room behind her. She knew because the other one, the laughing one, had his eyes. She touched nothing, said nothing. She walked out into the grey Wednesday afternoon and did not look back. That night, she sat by her bedroom window and watched the rain on the glass and let herself, just briefly, just for the length of 1 cup of cooling tea, stop trying to find the exit, not because she'd given up, but because something in the architecture of her certainty had developed, quietly in the course of one afternoon, a very small and very significant crack. Thursday arrived with unexpected sun. London, in Sophia's experience, occasionally produced mornings like this in late autumn, clear and cold and gold-lit, the air sharp enough to feel honest, the city briefly made beautiful by light at the right angle. She stood at her window and looked at it and felt, in some part of herself she couldn't locate precisely, that this was either a good sign or a particularly cruel joke. She was still working out which when Edmund Harlow arrived. He came at 11, without invitation, with the slightly too casual energy of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation and is now committed to having it. Sophia. He was shown into the sitting room before she could redirect him. I owe you an apology. You owe me considerably more than that. He had the grace at least to look genuinely uncomfortable. He sat without being invited, turned his hat in his hands, that gesture again she noticed, the ring, the turning, and said, I panicked. He came to me before you did. He made it clear that he stopped. It doesn't matter what he said, I should have told you. Why didn't you? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the hat in his hands, not at her, and when he spoke again, the easy charm was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was something she recognized as actual honesty. Because I thought if I helped you get away from him, he said, you might... He stopped again. Started again. I thought you might be grateful. Sophia looked at him. She felt, with a sudden and complete clarity, the shape of the thing she had not seen before. Not because it was hidden. It had been there in every proximity, every lingering conversation, every smooth response. She had simply not been looking for it. Edmund, she said carefully, I know. He stood abruptly, crossed to the window. I know, I've made a mess of this. You haven't made a mess, she said, more gently than she'd expected to. You've been honest, belatedly, but honestly. He turned to look at her. Do you want him? He asked. Blackmore. Do you want this? And there it was. The question that had been sitting in the middle of the room for 3 days, that she had been carefully navigating around without ever standing still long enough to look at directly. She opened her mouth, closed it. I don't know, she said. And the honesty of those 3 words cost her something. Not a great deal, but enough that she felt it. Edmund nodded slowly. Something in his face settled. Not resignation exactly, but the particular acceptance of a man who has run one calculation and arrived at its conclusion. He's a better man than I am, he said, which I find deeply irritating. Despite everything, she laughed. It was small and brief and slightly helpless, but it was real, and Edmund smiled at it. The real smile, not the practiced one. And for a moment, they were simply 2 people who had known each other for a long time, standing in the sun through a window. I'm sorry, Sophia, he said. I know you are, she said. He left quietly. She stood in the sitting room for a long time after he'd gone, and looked at the light on the carpet, and tried to take an honest inventory of where she was. She went to find James Blackmore. She didn't plan this. She didn't plan it, she didn't prepare for it, she didn't compose the conversation in advance the way she normally composed conversations in advance. She simply put on her coat and her gloves and walked to Blackmore House in the afternoon light with a directness that came from having stopped, finally, trying to think around the question. He was in the garden. The garden was not what she'd expected, which was, she was realizing, a pattern with this man. Not formal, not the kind of manicured geometry that large houses were supposed to have. It was overgrown in places, deliberate in others, with old trees along the far wall that had clearly been there for 100 years, and a stone bench near the center on which James Blackmore was sitting with no coat, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading a letter. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the path. He did not look surprised. She sat on the far end of the bench without asking, because the distance between them felt important. Not because she wanted it, but because she needed to say something, and she needed to be at a distance she could think from. Why didn't you stop me, she said. Any of it. The plan, Harlow. All of it. You could have intervened properly. You had every position to do so. He folded the letter with unhurried hands. Set it aside. Because you had the right to try, he said. That's not the strategic answer. No, he agreed. You could have simply... I could have, he said. I didn't. He looked at her directly, and there was something in this moment that was different from the ballroom, from the library, From every prior version of this, something quieter and more exposed, as though both of them had finally stopped using the furniture of the situation to stand behind. I didn't want to be the thing you couldn't escape. I wanted to be the thing you eventually decided wasn't worth escaping from. The sun was low and warm on the left side of her face. She felt her hands, folded in her lap, and the slight unsteadiness of her own breathing, which she was managing barely. "That," she said, "is a very arrogant position." "It is," he said simply. "You were sure I'd reach that point." "No." He said it clearly, honestly. "I was hoping." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, not the kind that demanded filling. The garden held it well. Somewhere above them a bird settled in one of the old trees and then departed, and the branch moved long after it had gone. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly. He looked at her. "Something no one knows," she added. "Not about your brother. Not about the arrangement. Something—" She paused, searching for the word. "Something small." He was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering, not performing consideration. "I hate the east wing of this house," he said. "Every room in it. I haven't used any of them in 4 years, and I've been unable to determine whether that's grief or simply preference." He looked at the old trees. "I suspect it's both." She absorbed this. "What's in the east wing?" "William's rooms. My mother's old sitting room. A music room no one uses." A pause. "A view of the garden. I haven't looked at from that angle since he died." Sophia looked at the garden, at the angle he hadn't been looking from, the east-facing windows dark above them, the old brick and the quiet glass. "I'll tell you something true in return," she said. He waited. "I've been planning exits since I was 12 years old," she said. "Every room I walk into, I find the door first. Every situation, I calculate the way out before I calculate anything else." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know how to be somewhere without knowing I could leave." He was very still beside her. "That's not a flaw," he said quietly. "It's not exactly a recommendation either." "It means you've always chosen to stay," he said. "Every time. You've stayed knowing exactly where the exit was. That's—" He stopped, started again more carefully. "That's not someone who doesn't know how to commit. That's someone who has never been given a reason to." The words landed somewhere very specific and very quiet in the center of her chest. She did not look at him. She looked at the old trees and the late afternoon sun on the stone path and the ordinary beautiful fact of a garden that had been left to grow in its own direction. "I'm not saying yes," she said. "I know. I'm saying—" She stopped, started again. "I'm saying that I don't know yet, and I wanted you to know that the not knowing is different from a no." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "That's enough." She couldn't sleep again. This time she didn't blame the wind. The house was dark and still, and the street outside was quiet, the particular quiet of a city that had finally, after midnight, stopped performing and set itself down for a few hours. Sophia lay on top of her bed and conducted, for the 3rd consecutive night, an inventory she could not seem to complete. The facts were as follows. She had spent 3 days trying to get away from a man she barely knew. In those 3 days the man had offered her every exit, shown her his grief without using it as leverage, asked her nothing that required her to be someone other than herself, stood in a cold garden without a coat reading letters, and not once looked at her like she was a prize. And, she added this last item slowly, deliberately, had told her that her lifelong instinct for exits was not a limitation, but evidence of every choice she had consciously made. No one had said that to her before. She had not known, until he said it, that she had needed someone to. She sat up. The room was very dark. The candle on the bedside table had burned down to nothing some time ago, and she hadn't replaced it, which meant the only light in the room came from the thin gap under the door, where the hall lamp was left burning, and from the faint silver of the street outside the window. She moved to the window, pushed aside the curtain, looked down. The street was empty. She stood there for several minutes, watching nothing in particular, and became gradually aware that she was doing the thing she always did when her mind reached a conclusion before she was ready to acknowledge it. She was looking for other things to look at. She was cataloguing the lamppost, the cobblestones, the silhouette of the house across the way, the faint movement of something, a cat probably, along the base of the iron railing. Anything except the conclusion sitting in the center of her chest, patient and clear and thoroughly inconvenient. She breathed once more. A movement below. She looked down. James Blackmore was standing on the opposite side of the street. Not in front of her house, across from it at the edge of the lamplight with his coat this time, one hand in his pocket, looking not up at her window, but down the street, as though he had come to stand there for his own reasons, and not as any kind of statement. He hadn't looked up. She watched him for a long moment, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness, which she had come to recognize as something different from coldness. He wasn't cold, he was contained. There was a considerable difference, she had spent 3 days learning, between a man who felt nothing and a man who felt everything very precisely and had simply gotten very good at where he kept it. She pushed open the window. The cold air came in, sharp and real. He heard it, looked up. Their eyes met across the dark street. Neither of them said anything. She could not read his expression from this distance, only its general quality, which was the same one she'd been cataloguing for 3 days. Full attention, no performance, simply present, in the way that some people are present when they have nowhere else they are trying to be. She was still in her nightgown, her hair was down, loose around her shoulders. She had not planned this, and she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who could not sleep, at the window in the middle of the night, for reasons she refused to state out loud. She reached into her room, picked up the contract from her windowsill, where she'd been keeping it for reasons she also refused to examine. She held it out into the air between them, not dropping it, just showing him that she had it, that she had been keeping it, that she had read it, all of it 3 times in the smallest hours of the preceding nights, and had not torn it. He looked at it, then he looked back up at her. She pulled it back inside, pressed it against her chest with both hands, breathed. He stood there for one more moment in the lamplight on the cold street, and then he did something she hadn't yet seen. He smiled. Not the ghost of one, not the echo of one. A real smile, quiet, slight and entirely private, belonging to no one else on the street or in the city or she suspected in his usual life, just to this moment, just to her. She felt it somewhere that had nothing to do with reason. She closed the window. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, with the contract in her hands and her hair loose around her shoulders, and the cold still on her face from the open window, and the shape of her breathing had changed in a way she couldn't fully explain. She sat there for a long time, and then, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they intend to keep, she opened the drawer of the bedside table and placed the contract inside it. Not thrown, not discarded, not destroyed. Kept. She lay back on her bed. She looked at the ceiling. She was not looking for the exit anymore. She had stopped looking for it somewhere between a library and a garden, and the window tonight had only confirmed what she had already, quietly and without ceremony, decided. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 4 days, she slept. The morning arrived without drama. No symbolic weather, no significant portent in the quality of the light. Just Friday, ordinary and clear, with a thin frost on the window and the sounds of the city assembling itself into its daily performance. Sophia sat at her dressing table and looked at herself and tried to locate fear. She found something else instead. Not certainty. Certainty would have felt too simple, too cleanly resolved for something this significant. What she found was something more honest than certainty. A willingness. A forward-leaning readiness to stand in the same room as the unknown and not require a map. She dressed without fuss. She chose the ivory gown. Not the grandest she owned, not the one designed for ceremony, but the one that fit her precisely, that moved the way she moved, that required nothing from her except to be herself inside it. Her maid reached for the formal pearl comb. Sophia shook her head. She put her hair up herself simply, with the small gold pin her mother had given her when she was 16, not for any occasion, just because, just on an ordinary afternoon, pressed into Sophia's palm with the words, "This suits you." A woman choosing what suited her. She looked at herself one more time. "All right," she said quietly, to no one. The ceremony had been arranged at St. George's, 11 o'clock. Her father met her at the bottom of the stairs. His face carried the specific complexity of a parent who knows they have made a decision that their child is about to accept, and who cannot tell whether the acceptance is resignation or something else entirely. He looked at her eyes. Something in him seemed to release. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question. He was confirming something he could see. "I'm all right," she agreed. He offered his arm. She took it. The church was small. No great congregation, no assembled spectators. This was not a public event. It was barely a formal one. A handful of witnesses, the vicar, the winter light coming through tall plain windows and laying itself across the stone floor in long, pale rectangles. James Blackmore was standing at the front. He was wearing dark blue, which was neither the expected black nor a performance of something warmer, just the considered choice of a man who dressed for himself and happened to have very precise taste. His hands were at his sides. He was standing completely still. He heard her enter. He turned, and the thing that happened in his face, Sophia would never find the right words for it, not in the hours and days and years that followed, not when people asked, not even when she tried to explain it to herself. It was not the gratitude of a man whose plan had worked. It was not the satisfaction of a man who had been proven right. It was something that looked remarkably like relief. Deep and private and entirely unperformed, the specific exhale of a man who had not been as certain as he'd appeared, who had hoped with more intensity than he'd allowed to show, and who was only now, in this moment, allowing himself to set that hoping down. She walked toward him. He watched every step. When she reached him, she looked up at him directly, no filters, no strategic assessments, and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "You should know that I make my own decisions." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "That's why I waited." The vicar began. She could feel through the cold air of the church the warmth of James standing beside her, near but not pressed, present without encroaching, giving her the full width of her own existence even in this smallest space. She listened to the words. She said the ones that were hers to say. And when it was over, when the vicar smiled and the witnesses shifted, and the pale winter light continued its indifferent work across the stone floor, James turned to her and offered his hand, and she placed hers in it, and the warmth of his fingers closing around hers was simple and real, and nothing like any story she'd been told. Outside the church, she stopped on the steps, turned her face up to the sky. The cold air was sharp in her lungs. The frost on the iron railing caught the light and threw it into small, brief pieces. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Breathing," she said. He stood beside her, not hurrying, and looked out at the street with the patience that was, she was beginning to understand, not a strategy, just who he was. "James," she said, the name for the first time. Just his name, plain and direct. He looked at her. "Don't be difficult to know," she said. He considered this. "I'll try." "That's not reassuring." "No," he agreed with the ghost of that smile. "But it's honest." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, her choice, her motion entirely, and they walked down the steps together into the ordinary Friday morning, and the city went on around them, unaware. 2 years later. Blackmore House, September. The window in the upstairs sitting room had been left open. It was the kind of September afternoon that couldn't quite commit to being autumn yet, the light still golden and unhurried, the garden below in that last warm stage of things before they turned, the air carrying something that smelled like cut grass, and the distant sweetness of the kitchen doing something ambitious with the last of the summer fruit. Sophia was reading. She was not, technically, reading effectively. The book was open on her lap, and her eyes had been on the same paragraph for approximately 6 minutes, because on the floor beside the chair, there was a small child engaged in a project of enormous importance involving a wooden block, a tin cup, and a very specific stacking sequence that kept failing. The child's name was William. He was 14 months old and had his father's dark eyes and her stubborn concentration and an opinion about the tin cup that he communicated with considerable force. He did not cry when the tower fell. He simply looked at the wreckage with the expression of a person running a diagnostic and began again. She had noticed this about him early. He didn't rage at failure. He assessed it. She suspected he had inherited that from James. She had inherited it from no one. She had built it herself slowly over years. It occurred to her sometimes, in moments like this one, quiet and unhurried, that her son had arrived with something she had taken decades to earn. She found this both humbling and in some way she couldn't explain, deeply satisfying. "You're doing it upside down," Sophia told him. William considered this feedback, picked up the cup, turned it over, set it back down, picked up the block. "Better," she said. He looked up at her with the specific expression of a person who has succeeded at something and is deciding whether to acknowledge the advice that contributed to the success. He was already his father's son. She heard the door. James came in without knocking. He had stopped knocking on his own rooms a year ago, which she had marked as a significant development at the time because it meant he was finally treating the house as a shared space and not a territory he was trying not to impose on. She had said nothing about it. She had simply noticed and felt something warm and specific lodge in her chest and filed it away in the growing catalogue of things she loved about being here. He stopped when he saw the floor situation. "He's building something," Sophia told him. "What is it?" "I don't know. He doesn't narrate." James crouched down to William's level in one fluid movement, resting his forearms on his knees, looking at the block arrangement with the same complete attention he gave everything. William looked at him, picked up the block, held it out. James took it, placed it, carefully, exactly where it needed to go. William studied the result, seemed to accept it, made a sound that was not quite a word, but carried the unmistakable energy of approval. Then he moved on to a new project involving the fringe of the rug. James stayed crouched for a moment, watching him, and Sophia watched James. The line of his shoulders, the slight softening around his mouth that only appeared in rooms like this one, in hours like this one, when it was just the three of them, and he had forgotten to be the Duke, and the afternoon light came through the open window and lay itself across the floor between them. He looked up. "You're not reading," he said. "I was." "For how long?" "Meaningfully. Maybe 10 minutes. The corner of his mouth moved. He stood, came to lean against the window frame near her chair, looking out at the garden below. She knew what he was looking at. For the past 6 months, he had been using the east wing again, slowly, room by room, with the careful pace of someone choosing every single time to stay. The music room had been opened in March. William's old rooms, his brother William's rooms, had been opened in July, aired out, the furniture moved to let the light in. He had not told her he was going to do it. She had simply found him there one afternoon, standing in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and the window open, looking at the garden from the east angle he hadn't looked from in 4 years. She had stood in the doorway and said nothing. He had turned, seen her, and said, "The view is better than I remembered." She had walked in and stood beside him and looked at the garden with him, and they had stayed there until the light changed, and neither of them had needed to explain anything to the other. That was, she thought, what 2 years of learning a person looked like. Not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations, just standing beside each other in the rooms that cost something to enter, and staying until the light changed. "There's something I need to tell you," James said. She looked up. He was looking at his hands, a gesture she recognized now, one of the few tells he had. A man who carried most things internally, and only showed the weight when it had reached a certain point. "Eleanor," he said. "The midwife confirmed this morning." Sophia went very still. The room held its breath around her, William on the rug, the open window, the September light on the floor, all of it suspended in the particular silence of a moment that is becoming something you will remember for the rest of your life. Then she laughed. It came out sudden and warm and entirely real, the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission first, that arrives before the mind can style it into something more composed. It came from somewhere very deep and very certain, and it filled the room with a quality of light that had nothing to do with the afternoon. James looked at her with that expression she had first seen on the church steps, that private and careful relief, and she stood up from the chair and reached up and took his face in both her hands, the way she'd learned he sometimes needed. The physical fact of her being there, choosing to be there, present and warm and entirely deliberate, as the thing that completed whatever sentence he was building internally. "Eleanor," she repeated, "if it's a girl." "It's a girl," she said, with the confidence of someone making a promise. He looked at her, directly, fully, the way he had looked at her from the very beginning, back when she had found it unnerving and hadn't yet understood that what unsettled her was not the intensity of it, but the fact that it asked for nothing. "You're certain," he said, not skeptically. Just the way he said most things to her now, which was with a warmth so understated it had taken her months to learn to recognize it as warmth. "Completely," she said. His hands came up to cover hers, warm and steady, pressing them gently against his face. On the rug, William had abandoned the fringe and was now attempting to stand, gripping the side of Sophia's chair with both fists, concentrating with the absolute totality of a person for whom this is, at this exact moment, the most important project in the world. James noticed. She felt it in the slight shift of his attention. He could track that child across a room without appearing to, which she had concluded was some specific variety of love that didn't have a name yet. He released her hands slowly, crouched down beside the chair, placed one hand lightly behind William's back, not holding, not steering, just there. William pulled himself upright, stood, swayed, stood again, looked at his father. James said nothing, just looked back at him with that complete, unhurried attention, the kind that had once made Sophia feel seen in a way she didn't know how to categorize, and now simply felt like home. William made his sound of approval, let go of the chair, took 2 steps, sat down. James stayed crouched, looking at him. Again, he said quietly. William looked at the chair, grabbed it, pulled himself back up. Sophia watched the two of them, the small, serious face and the larger, serious face, the same dark eyes at 2 entirely different heights, both of them engaged with the same focused sincerity in a task that mattered because it mattered to both of them, and felt the full specific weight of where she was. Not the house. Not the title, the rooms, the garden in September light. Not even this man, whom she had spent 4 days trying to escape and 2 years learning the precise and particular shape of. This, the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a life she had walked into with her eyes open, knowing exactly where the door was, and chosen every single day since to stay inside. Later, William asleep, the house quiet in the way it went quiet after his particular energy had been extracted from it. She and James sat in the garden as they often did in September, on the stone bench she had first sat on in October 2 years ago, watching the last of the light leave the old trees. He had brought 2 cups of tea, set hers beside her without ceremony, the way he did most things for her, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, simply because it occurred to him that she might want it. She picked it up, held the warmth of it in both hands. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the East Wing music room." He looked at her. "William will need somewhere to be loud," she said. "And Eleanor." She let the name sit for a moment, let it become real in the air between them. "Eleanor will probably be opinionated about everything, including music." Something moved in his face, the particular shift she had catalogued over 2 years of paying attention to a man who showed things slowly, a movement around his eyes, a slight deepening of breath, the quality of stillness that in him meant the opposite of stillness. "You're suggesting we open it properly," he said. "I'm suggesting it's time." He looked at the house, at the east-facing windows, still dark in the evening shadow. She watched him look at them with the careful patience of someone who had learned that some things required witnessing, not managing. "William would have liked this," he said. His brother's name, said plainly. He had started doing that, saying it plainly without the brief controlled pause that used to precede it. She had noticed when it changed. She had not said anything about it, because some things didn't need to be named to be real. "Tell me about him," she said. He looked at her. "You never ask." "I'm asking now." A long pause. The old trees moved slightly in the evening air. "He laughed at everything," James said. "Not cruelly, just everything struck him as worth finding funny. He could find the comedy in a contract dispute." A very quiet beat. He would have found the comedy in all of this. "You, the 4 days, Harlow." He would have been insufferable about it. Sophia smiled. "I think I would have liked him." "He would have liked you immediately," James said, which would have annoyed him greatly because he prided himself on taking time with people. She laughed softly, set her cup down, leaned back and looked at the sky, the first stars becoming visible at the edge of the deep blue, the September darkness settling in around the edges of the gold. "James," she said. You know what I've never told you?" He turned to look at her. "The morning of Friday," she said, "before the church, I sat at the dressing table and I looked for fear." She paused. "I couldn't find it." He was very still. "What did you find?" he said. "I don't know the exact word for it," she said honestly. "Something that felt like standing at a window that you've just decided to open." She looked at him. Not jumping, not falling, just deciding to let the air in. The garden was quiet around them. The last of the light was gone from the trees now, just the dark shapes of them against the darkening sky, and the stone bench was cold through her dress, and the tea had gone warm to cool in her hands, and none of it mattered at all. James reached across the small space between them and covered her hand with his, unhurried, no drama, just the simple, deliberate warmth of it. "I knew," he said quietly, "the moment you held the contract out the window." "You did not." "I did," the ghost of a smile. "I also knew you'd pull it back." She looked at him. "And that didn't worry you?" "No." He turned her hand over gently in his. "It told me you were keeping it." She looked down at their hands, at the way his wrapped around hers, not holding her in place, never that, just present, available, a warmth she could choose to lean into or not, every single time, and always chose. "We should go in," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved. The garden held them in its September dark, and above them the stars continued their indifferent and beautiful work, and somewhere inside the house, William slept the deep, untroubled sleep of someone who does not yet know that the world is complicated, and a room in the east wing waited to be filled with noise. Sophia turned her face up to the sky. James sat beside her, not hurrying. He never hurried. She had spent 4 days finding the exit. She had spent 2 years choosing every morning and every evening not to use it. And there was not one moment of those 2 years, not one ordinary morning with cold tea and a child on the floor, not one evening in the garden with the old trees moving in the dark, that she would have traded for the version of herself who had gotten away. She breathed. The air smelled like cut grass and the end of summer and the very beginning of something else. She kept the hand that held hers. She stayed.
To silence, 4 nights to breathe, a name on a paper, a promise I didn't believe,
a carriage in shadow,
a knock at the door,
a man made of winter, and something more.
I never asked for devotion,
I never claimed your heart.
I only stood in the doorway waiting for you to start.
You had 4 days to run,
4 nights to change your mind,
but somewhere between the silence, you stopped looking for the line.
and I never chased your leaving.
I never closed the door.
You weren't afraid of loving.
You were afraid of more. I watched from the lamplight across the cold street.
You held the contract like it was defeat.
But hope is a quiet thing.
It doesn't demand.
It waits in the garden
With open hands.
You never cornered.
You never claimed.
You just stood steady
and said my name.
You had thrown eyes to war. You had 4 days to run,
4 nights to decide.
but love isn't thunder. It's choosing to stay inside.
And I never needed victory.
I never needed control.
I only needed your honesty.
More than the road. It wasn't the vow,
Wasn't the ring,
it wasn't the ring.
it was the way you waited.
Without asking anything,
It wasn't the promise or fear of goodbye. It was a look in your eyes when I chose not to fly.
we had 4 days of dying. 4 days,
One choice,
one quiet voice
not yet
became my